It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Tyler O'Neill, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, The Woketopus, The Dark Money Cabal Manipulating the Federal Government. Tyler, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, and congrats on saying the name right. I don't know how many people will introduce it and be like, Woketopus. I'm like, no, Woketopus. Woke octopus. But
well, I spend many hours looking at manuscripts, so maybe I've just, I was able to sound it out better than most. I'll feel really good. That made my whole day. I sounded something out right. I think the place I'd love to begin, this is our first time meeting, so I'd love to hear, as well as my audience, a bit of the Tyler O'Neill origin story, superpowers, special abilities, secrets you've never told your family. What do we need to know to remember you?
Wow. Yeah, I think it's hard to say. I mean, my superpower, I'll go with St. Paul's answer that my superpowers are my weaknesses. God's strength is made perfect in that. But I grew up in the People's Republic of Boulder in Colorado. That's where I was born. I always like to say I revolted into orthodoxy in early youth and grew up in Golden. But yeah, I came to faith very young. My mom, who was the quintessential boomer, she had, the 70s flower child and then the 70s religious, right, Christian flowering, both experiences. So if you see her, she's the one in the choir with the very colorful outfit who is belting her heart out, praising Jesus. And, I think she encapsulates both those movements very well. And, I came to faith at a young age. I prayed the prayer when I was in Switzerland. And I remember because the very next day, a swarm of bees came by my ear and I made the mistake of hitting him. And I think God was telling me early on, this isn't going to be easy. But yeah, I came to more flowering of my faith in high school and college. I read Friedrich Nietzsche and C.S. Lewis, and reading, the Mere Christianity, the Abolition of Man, really fantastic works. And then I went to Hillsdale College, where I got to study the great tradition of the West and history and the pillars that form our civilization. And so now I've been in the city I affectionately refer to as Mordor, Washington, D.C. area for a little over 10 years as a journalist, writer, editor, and, just following all of these things that came together. I've been really following the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the one issue that probably animates me the most is the way that conservatives and Christians are demonized by the left, by the legacy media, by the universities, constantly suggested that we're bigots, that we're haters. And of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center is the worst of the worst on that, because they put conservative Christian organizations on a map with chapters of the Ku Klux Klan. And that map has inspired an act of terrorism. Yet in the Biden administration, federal law enforcement thought, hey, let's bring in the Southern Poverty Law Center as the expert on hate and domestic terrorism. So that's really what sparked the book. Not to get too far ahead, still talking about my superpowers, but I've been focused on the SPLC for years. I think they had a really noble start, but my first book was about them making hate pay, the corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and this kind of grew out of that continual effort.
Well, I'd love to pull on one more thread of the origin story and just hear, what was it that drew you into the world of journalism and politics? And then also, I think one of the exciting things about the age we're in is there is kind of a whole new breath being put into conservative media. It says the Daily Signal behind you, outlets like the Daily Wire, many others. Like, we're in a whole new heyday that we didn't even see coming, it seems like 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's excellent. I think when you talk about superpowers, my superpower is something I developed starting in 5th grade. I remember the AP American History tests and the way that you had to research a topic and then write an essay about it. And that I've always welcomed that kind of challenge. So one of the things I love about journalism is that I get to brush up on something, go to the original sources, figure out what the real crux of the debate is, and then turn around an article about it really fast because you want to educate the people and you want to write it while it's still fresh. And I love the challenge of going through that. As for conservative media, I think you're exactly right. We are in a flowering, a flourishing of conservative media. And that's largely due to a confluence of factors. I mean, you had Elon Musk purchasing Twitter, having the Twitter files expose how, I mean, we all knew that there was media bias and corruption and social media censorship. Like I'd been reporting on it at PJ Media. I'd been reporting about it on Fox when I was at Fox News Digital. Um, Telling the stories of conservatives who were booted from big tech platforms for saying something that's very common sense. And then with the Twitter files, that just got blown like all the corruption was revealed. And now you still have the elites trying to bring their woke orthodoxy, their fake consensus down on us from on high. They're still fighting for that. And Trump is going to have to work hard. But right now, a lot of Americans, you've had the moment where the wizard was revealed behind the curtain. And the American people know the truth. And you can't put that genie back in the bottle. And so a lot of people are rightly searching for these alternative sources. And the way it's been in conservative media, because we thought it was great in 2014, 2015, 2016. This was the moment when Facebook was big, the Drudge Report was linking a lot of things, driving good traffic to original reporting from conservative news outlets, allowing for the rise of this ecosystem. And then after Trump wins, Facebook puts the hammer down. Drudge, suddenly stops linking conservative sources. You have this movement, I think starting really the worst of it started after January 6th, where conservative media was being pushed down. But we're resilient. And right now, we're talking to people on the Hill. The Daily Signal is very well, we're constantly in contact with Republicans in Congress, and they understand, more than they have previously, that it's really important to give scoops, give access. President Trump in the first White House press briefing has that chair directed to alternative media. And this sends a really important message that, look, your politicos, your APs, these outlets that for years have suggested there was no alternative view to transgenderism, for instance. They would constantly platform transgender activists and then never say, oh, they would never even do the normal journalistic thing, which is to say, there are people who disagree with this, or, there are many Americans who disagree. Like, you'll find their reporting, whenever they reported on a conservative issue, it's like, oh, yeah, and there's all this criticism from, if it's from abortion, if they have to cover the March for Life, they have to say, oh, well, all the mainstream medical associations support abortion, and this is why it's great, and that will be part of their background. But on every trans issue, it was always just, no, the Human Rights Campaign says this, WPATH says this, trans healthcare is established, there is no opposition to it. And that has rightly rankled Americans who know, like, they're not being given the truth. And so that's why you see, I mean, even the rise of centrist outlets like Barry Weiss's The Free Press. And I think Barry Weiss is still a liberal, but she's willing to actually talk with people like Ted Cruz. She's willing to, reveal the corruption on the progressive left. It's yeah, I think it really feels like there's morning in America, but there's a lot more to grow. A lot more. The Daily Signal is one of the most dynamic places right now. We've just brought in a new managing editor. So I had been the managing editor. Now I'm moving into more of a writing role. But we have great connections on the Hill. We have press credentials. in the White House, in Congress. We are bringing new scoops to our audience, and we're going to be on the cutting edge of all of this. So, remember the Daily Wire? Yes, they're doing excellent work. The Daily Caller, they're doing excellent work. Don't forget the Daily Signal. We're also doing great work. But yeah, I think conservative media is in a great place right now, and I'm excited for the future.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. And my hope is that it encourages more people to get out there and become content creators and get their voice out there. Like if you have strong opinions and you'd like to influence people, well, hey, step into it. Maybe to be really influential, we might need to all have daily somehow worked into the names of our shows or our network. But because I've heard other people say recently, this is probably the worst time to start a show or a podcast because it's so saturated. Yet, if you're willing to jump into a niche and do a really good job, I feel like there's plenty of opportunity out there for more voices. And so, don't be scared. Jump out and see what happens. I would love to have you talk to the dedication you have in the front of the book. I felt like it was a good reminder to why we often all do the hard work we do. We keep pushing. We're sometimes striving for things that you and I will never see during our lifetime, but it's actually for that further generation. So talk to us about who you dedicate the book to and why.
Yeah, I dedicated it to my son Tristan. And he's just this. I always wanted to have a boy first, and then God gave us a girl, and then I was so in love with my girl that I'm like, all right, I want another girl, and then God gives me a boy, and I'm just like, the blessings of having a son, having a daughter are incalculable. And but I look at my son and I think, there are so many things in this country that will make life harder for him. And how do I, dedicate my efforts to exposing the negative forces that might make life worse for him than it was for me? And so we often we take so much for granted in this country. We have um and this is why I love studying histories, because not only do we have the ability to travel across the world, really cleanly. We need to tell the climate alarmists that, the scaremongering they do about burning carbon emissions is just totally baseless. The United States, the way that we burn our fossil fuels today is incredibly clean. You used to have smog in American cities that would look like China does, some Chinese cities do today. And now that's non existent because we have made the burning of fossil fuels so clean. Anyway, that's one of like a million examples, because I think of how I live today. This morning I was able to wake up and take a hot shower. And then I was able to, when we fed our kids, and I was able to have a microwaved breakfast burrito, that you could take from the freezer so it stays good forever. You can put it in the microwave, warm it up. You can have a warm meal, a hot meal in a couple of minutes. And we do need to get into fixing our health environment. Like the fact that we consume so many carbohydrates that we do is a problem. The fact that we're subsidizing sugar, like there are problems about our world today. But the level of prosperity we have would have been incomprehensible to somebody like Martin Luther, even to somebody like George Washington, I think. And I think of the fact of my teeth. I still have all my physical teeth, yet one or two of them have died, and I had root canals. But because our dentistry is so good, uh, the tooth is still there. Like we were able to preserve my teeth, and this is something that most of history, your teeth fall out. You have a problem with a cavity, and your tooth starts to die. You're lucky if you can just get the tooth out and not have problems. Like teeth, most teeth throughout history looked horrible. And today we have a system that sometimes goes too far. But anyway, all those things aside, like I think it is very important to preserve the freedom and the innovation that we have in this country for the next generation. That's why I wrote the book.
And as a publishing guy, I'm always kind of curious about the story behind the book, the catalyst. You mentioned your previous book earlier with, that was a big focus on the SPLC. For the new book, like what was it that started you down the path? I always feel like there's a story in there somewhere.
Yeah. Well, so I remember when I first came out to Washington, D.C., and I was interning with, I think I was with the Washington Free Beacon, but I would go to many events in DC, and I would go to events with the Heritage Foundation. I would go to events with the Family Research Council, and I knew some of the people at the Family Research Council, and I knew that they were good people. They cared about preserving marriages between a man and a woman. They cared about religious freedom. They cared about fighting for life on the abortion issue. And then I heard that someone had shot up the Family Research, had gone in with a semi-automatic pistol and a bag of Chick-fil-A chicken sandwiches, planned to shoot everyone in the building and smear a Chick-fil-A sandwich in their faces. And the reason they did this was because of the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map. And so I first covered the story, I think it was about a year later. It was when the guy was sentenced, the terrorist who actually is a convicted terrorist. He pled guilty because he was the only person ever to plead guilty under Washington, D.C.'s new terrorism law, which is a very interesting, side factor to all this. But that was the first moment when I thought, huh, this is really horrible. Like, I know the people at the Family Research Council, they're not a hate group. And fast forward to 2017, when, you had two events that really happened in 2017 that drew attention to the Southern Poverty Law. First was that I think it was GuideStar released GuideStar. For those who don't know, is a website that analyzes all the nonprofits in the U.S. and it's used by donors to see, oh, is this group managing its assets well? Maybe I should give to this group. Maybe I shouldn't give to this group. GuideStar added the SPLC's uh, hate group label to every organization that was on the SPLC. And so this was shocking. And luckily, one of the groups, Liberty Council, filed a lawsuit against GuideStar. And so that drew attention more to the SPLC as an issue. Then, when the Charlottesville white nationalist riots happened, the Southern Poverty Law Center capitalized on that. And you had big companies, you had CNN plastering the hate map all over their own website. You had a $500,000 contributions and $1 million, I believe it was, from Apple, from J.P. Morgan Chase. Everybody saying we need to give the SPLC money because this shows the SPLC is fundamental to fighting hate. And of course, it seems like none of them understood that the SPLC is a political weapon and an ideological weapon to silence the left's opponents, to enforce its ideology on America. And I thought it would be really important to reveal. So, like, I had written multiple stories about all of these things. And then there were lawsuits that hit the SPLC. There was this, there was that, there was so much. And then in 2019, there was a scandal where the SPLC fired its co-founder and amid a racial discrimination and sexual harassment claim. And so I thought, surely, if anything was going to convince the left that this organization is corrupt and should not be trusted, it would be this scandal. And no, they just kept working with the SPLC. So I decided, nothing was going to prevent me from writing a book about this because I wanted to have all the arguments in one place. I wanted to go through the history. I wanted to prove step by step that this organization was not reliable, that it was causing a threat to America's free speech. And so I did that. And that book didn't get as much traction. I think a lot of conservatives already knew the SPLC wasn't credible, but I think it's still an excellent resource for them. There have been lawsuits since that have been spurred by some of the reporting in my book. So, I think I'm very proud of the effort that I did there. But I think seeing the Biden administration sidle up with the SPLC again and again and again, I would write these stories. I was really, it outrages me on a personal level because, I'm a conservative Christian who agrees with, I think the SPLC, it started with noble intentions, right? It did important things early on, but the way that it smears people is beyond the pale. And it doesn't just smear people like me, it smears people who will make arguments that help broaden the narrative, that allow people to understand the truth that I understand. And I think they are causing, just this past year, not only did the SPLC put Gays Against Groomers, which is an LGBTQ group, they put them on the hate map and they called them an anti-LGBTQ plus hate group. This is a group of gay people who, I don't agree with on everything. Obviously, I believe that their identities are based in a sinful activity, but I think we can understand, like, they agree with us that the transgender insanity is bad and harms children, and it's important for us to make alliances with people who are willing to protect children from something that is absolutely egregious. So the fact that the SPLC would silence them and attack them in this way is shocking. But there are also groups of doctors that the SPLC demonize, put on the hate map, because they disagree with the transgender, gender affirming care consensus. So all that to say, this is why I started researching. And when I started researching for the Woketopus, I realized that the SPLC was only one among many of these radical leftist groups that are pushing their ideology on the American people and working with the administrative state. Because one of the things a lot of people don't realize, if you're lucky, you will have learned about the Constitution in school. Those nifty checks and balances that the founders made to protect us and ensure majority rule while protecting minority rights. Really important basic civic stuff. That's not the way our government actually works today. We have this vast administrative state, 438 alphabet soup agencies, so many that you can't keep track of them. It's just not possible. There's the Department of Health and Human Services, which under, even just in HHS, you have FDA, you have CDC, you have, all these different organizations, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, that are part of this Mandarin bureaucracy. And so this bureaucracy issues far more regulations than Congress passes laws every year. And so you have this natural, insulated bureaucracy that sometimes the president can't fire people because they have civil service protections. They have this thing called public sector unions. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt thought this was a horrible idea. And essentially what these unions are, they represent public servants against the people's elected representatives who the people elect to run the government. So you have this really noxious situation where you're incentivizing, you're making an institution out of public servants pushing back against the people who the people elect to oversee the public servants. And this is something even FDR didn't like. When you have an insulated bureaucracy like, it's very easy for woke activist groups to infiltrate and capture this bureaucracy. And that's what we've seen happen. It happened with fits and starts beforehand, but under Biden, it was, the floodgates were open. And it was very easy for me to trace. There's this group called the Center for American Progress that was founded by John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman in 2016. The Center for American Progress fed more than 60 officials into the administrative state under Biden. So the Center for American Progress, to some degree, was really calling the shots in policy. We all are wondering, because when Biden had that horrible debate with Trump and everybody said, and the Democrats decided they were going to force Biden out of the race, he went kicking and screaming, by the way. I think it's important that we remember this. I think all that revealed that Biden was little more than a figurehead with this vast woke apparatus that was controlling the federal government. And the problem with previous Republican presidents like George W. Bush was that they never really took on this administrative state the way that you need to. And Trump now, Trump almost couldn't do it in his first administration because from the get-go, you had Russiagate. He was constantly defending himself from this smear that swallowed his entire presidency. Russiagate, impeachment, like everything. Now he's actually able to be more aggressive. And my book lays out all the woke activist groups that were calling the shots that need to be, they're entrenching in the deep state right now, and they need to be called out and combated.
I think the place I'd love to know next or go next is just have you talk a little bit about how does the kind of the dark money system work? And again, Woketopus, like you have some graphics in the book that kind of show like the tentacles of an octopus. This money goes here, there, and everywhere, and back
Yes.
and forth. Where, yeah, I imagine it would take a lot of time to figure that out. It would look confusing, just like, oh my gosh, there's got to be a few hours of research into that. But just, I think the average person has no clue how this money funnels all over back and forth through so many different organizations to fund what we'll be talking about in a few minutes for the later chapters.
Yeah. So I think the big thing, zeroing out what I was able to do, and this is something like conservative journalists have been focused on George Soros, the Open Society Foundation, for a while. Luckily, we also had a really important book called Arabella that the Capital Research Center put out. And that was exposing a really big dark money network on the left that funds a lot of these activist groups. And then there are other dark money funders through the Tides Foundation. A lot of this money, by the way, it comes from huge donors like Teresa Heinz Carey. It comes from the Rockefeller family. And it comes from George Soros himself is extremely wealthy and created Open Society Foundations to direct money. Of course, his son Alex is now running it. But what you're able to find, I did the research to trace these lines of funding because it's all reported to the federal government. You have to, like when you're a nonprofit, you report all the grants that you receive. And so it's not hard. It takes a lot of time, but you can trace all the grants that these organizations receive. So like the fact that the Southern Poverty Law Center received a tremendous grant from Open Society Foundation, received money through the Arabella Advisors network of nonprofits. These funding streams help prop up these activist groups, and in some cases, like with the George Soros Foundation, Soros has been funding pretty much every leftist cause you've ever heard of for decades, and he's also worked closely with USAID, which it sounds like it's aid. We all know from this week, thank God Elon Musk has been blowing the roof off that organization. But like it isn't about aid for people. It isn't about feeding starving kids in Africa. This organization is directing US funding to all sorts of woke priorities. I mean, there were, transgender operas, transgender plays, and then of course pushing DEI in the workplaces. I think it was in Albania. It's just like what possible US interest is it to push DEI in workplaces in another part of the globe? And then you realize, wait, all of this funding, it has signaling effects that the United States stands for these woke priorities. And then some of that funding influences the United States too. Because when you have global companies like social media companies that you have this funding promoting woke causes in, say, Europe, and suddenly European countries can create laws that say, all right, social media has to censor these certain things or they're booted from Europe. You're suddenly forcing American companies to censor information that's coming from Americans. And, this is a really brilliant and sadistic way to get around the First Amendment in this country because you have this foreign funding stream that props up this censorship industrial complex that then comes back home. And anyway, that is a whole different can of worms that is broader than the scope of the book. But the point that I make when bringing that up is that George Soros is very connected with USAID. It is gobsmacking the connections. Like I started to look at this because I thought, it's probably likely. And then I realized not only does Open Society Foundations fund the same places that are getting grants from USAID, but they also had an open relationship where they listed, the George Soros partnerships listed USAID as a partner, and then they sued USAID twice, and it made it to the Supreme Court. And it was back when President Bush had his AIDS funding initiative, and Congress passed, and the president signed a law saying, we're sending this money, but you can't receive this money unless you oppose prostitution. And the George Soros Open Society Foundation's group that was working internationally sued USAID saying, no, we represent and we have partners who won't condemn prostitution and need to get this money. And they actually won the first Supreme Court case on that. They sued again and then another one. But if you have the close ties with USAID such that you have standing to sue in court, much less at the Supreme Court level, that means that reveals a tremendous amount of the fact that you are connected. There's an extreme connection here. And so cracking down on USAID is weakening Soros's global empire.
And you cover so many interesting things in the book. I think we need like a 3-hour interview to cover all of the places you take us. But I want to focus on a few that I think that are top of mind for a lot of the listeners and viewers. Those of us who've been paying attention to anything happening in the news conversation in the last 6 months. Talk to us a little bit about the weaponization of law enforcement to paint conservatives, faith-based groups all of a sudden as terrorists and lawbreakers. I think that shocked so many of us where we're like, what? You're putting old ladies praying at abortion clinics in prison, and just things that I don't think anybody would have attempted at all in years past. It was just like dumbfounding. How do we get there? What are some of the forces at work that even made that possible?
Yeah. Well, when President Trump said, they're not going after me, they're going after you, I'm just in the way, I think the left revealed that that is true in spades, especially in 2021, 2022, 2023. So my chapter goes into 3 specific grand narratives. One of them is, of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which I don't want to make everything about the SPLC. A lot of it just happens to be, though. Like, remember that memo the FBI put out going after radical traditional Catholics? Their source for that was the Southern Poverty Law Center. President Biden nominated an SPLC attorney to a top federal judgeship. And then when the SPLC came out with their hate map, putting Moms for Liberty on the map with chapters of the Ku Klux Klan, Moms for Liberty, a parental rights organization where parents saw what their kids were learning in COVID, or what their kids were being forced out of schools and learning on Zoom during COVID. The parental rights movement naturally arose as a response to that because schools were pushing critical race theory, they were pushing transgender ideology, and of course, they were holding kids back by keeping them at home rather than having them in school, having so many concrete impacts also on kids' psychological health to cover their faces with masks all day. It's just insane what happened, and we all need to remember. I think we all want to blot COVID out of our memories, but we have to remember what happened, and people need to be held accountable because COVID lifted the veil on the way that the left forces its ideology on us. Anyway, that's the Southern Poverty Law Center, big part of the chapter. Another part of the chapter is the National School Boards Association and the way that they worked with the White House when they drafted their letter comparing concerned parents to domestic terrorists. And then, the FBI immediately hopped on this. So I think it's important for us to remember this was at a time when parents were demanding schools return to in-person learning, and they were concerned about critical race theory and gender ideology being forced on their kids. And the teachers union said, no, let's keep everything shut down as long as possible. And that's chapter 2 of the book. But the National School Boards Association said, this is an opportunity for us to demonize the dissenters and essentially weaponize the law enforcement against them. So they write a letter to, and I don't know how, Chip Slavin has dodged some responsibility, but he also said, oh, we weren't really doing this. And I'm like, yeah, you were. I mean, if you look at the letter, early drafts of the letter, not only compare parents to domestic terrorists, but call for action under the Patriot Act and other things to silence the dissent here. And look, if there really were physical attacks on school boards, that would be one thing. But this was a peaceful movement, and many of the violent incidents, like the case in Loudoun County, were really situations of parents trying to get a word in edgewise, being forced out by the school boards. Anyway, that's a big aspect of it. They sent a letter to the White House, and then immediately the DOJ launched their own investigation into threats at school board meetings. It's all portraying parents as domestic terrorists, and it's insane that happened. And then finally, the pro-life protesters. After Dobbs struck down Roe, you had uh, you had pro-abortion vandals going to pro-life pregnancy centers across the country, sometimes firebombing them, writing threatening messages saying, Ruth's or Jane's revenge. This is Jane Doe. We'll have revenge on you. All this really horrible, like terrorist stuff. The DOJ just sits back and says, oh, nothing to see here. Or my favorite was when Merrick Garland said they were doing this at night, so we couldn't prosecute them. As if the DOJ had no ability to trace anybody down if they're breaking the law at night. And then, of course, they rounded up pro-life protesters. And many of these protesters were not only peaceful, some of them were, doing sit-ins. And, there's a level of like, when you're a pro-life protester, sometimes you want to stop the killing of the unborn and you think it is worth it to break the law for that. And I think, there's a case to be made. Sometimes it makes sense for someone who goes in, shackles themselves to the door of the abortion clinic or something to face a slap on the wrist. These people were getting long prison sentences, federal charges. And then in some cases, like in the case of Mark Hawk, he just stood up for his son who had been harassed by an abortion clinic worker. But local authorities didn't bring any charges because they said there's no case here. But then the Biden DOJ comes in and says, no, you violated the FACE Act. And they slap him with these big charges. They go and arrest him in a pre-dawn raid, waking up all his family and going in with their guns ready as though he were some narco terrorist. And this is just a dad who had gone to a protest and there had been a violent altercation between his son and this abortion clinic worker, and he stood up for his son. And like, this is the level of insanity we saw under the Biden administration. Any excuse they could to paint conservatives, pro-lifers, religious freedom proponents as evil and as a domestic terror threat, they took.
I think the next chapter I'd like to jump into briefly is the ground you cover in chapter 7, talking about the immigration industrial complex. I know a lot of us looked on dumbfounded watching the news, seeing things on social media as the country was just flooded with immigrants over the past couple of years. Just wondering, like, how is this like functionally, structurally at this level? How is it even possible? Like, there has to be some level of money and organization behind this because it's just too many too soon and all at once. So, I think that again, I suspect we'll see Doge and other parties reveal way more about what's been happening behind the scenes. But what are some of the money at play and I'll put it in quotes, kind of religious charities at work? They may have certain things in their name, but it's maybe not all of the best intentions.
Yeah. So there are two aspects of that chapter. First is, how did it happen? And I think to some degree the left had been going in this direction for a while. There was a lot of anger at Obama for carrying out deportations. We tend to forget, Obama was a changer. He really wanted to fundamentally change our country, but even his administration didn't do the kind of insane things we saw under Biden. And one of the reasons is that Biden was controlled by these woke activist groups more. So there are three groups I highlight in that chapter that were at the starting end of it. One of them is a group called America's Voice. and then there's the Center for American Progress and the American Civil Liberties Union. And all three of these groups were pressuring the Biden administration when it was coming in, during the transition. They were saying, and I love the way the Center for American Progress puts it, because I think this is exactly what the Biden administration did. They said the Department of Homeland Security needs to treat immigration as an asset to be managed, not a crime to be enforced against. And so you look at what we saw was a cultural transformation at the Department of Homeland Security. It wasn't just Biden signing a couple of executive orders, which he did, and got rid of all the things that Trump had done to stem the flow of migrants at the border. But Biden also, I don't know if you're familiar with the CHNV program. He decided that Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans all needed to come to the United States because they face problems in their countries. And it's like, look, I get the charitable impulse of helping people, but what he did with this program, they had flights of all these immigrants, and they were illegal immigrants. Congress never approved anything like this. This was all just the Biden administration's own initiative. So everybody that the Biden administration they flew these flights of thousands of people into the United States. And I mean, it's not just that they opened the border. It's also that they actually imported people in the name of, being humanitarian. And, Congress has to approve these things. If you're an illegal immigrant, it's not just because, the administration doesn't like you. It's because we have laws in this country that were passed by Congress and signed by the president that lay out the pathways for citizenship, for legal entry, and for everything like that. If we want to change those laws, we should change those laws through Congress. Biden circumvented that whole process. And these woke activist groups helped staff his administration in DHS and then implement them. The second aspect, which is almost more pernicious, is all of these charities. And it kills me because I see Catholic charities. I've fought for Catholic charities to have religious freedom. Like, I think these groups do some good things. But when I peeled back the onion, when I saw what was happening here, it was utterly infuriating what people are doing in the name of our faith. And I mean, in pretty much any denomination you come from, there is an activist group that what they were doing during this administration, they were housing and then transporting illegal aliens throughout the country. So they're one of the reasons why the border crisis became a national crisis, why you saw Venezuelan gangs in Colorado, hundreds of miles away from the border, going, near where I grew up, where I went to school, going with their AK-47s through that housing unit. I mean, it was like we weren't living in this country anymore. And one of the reasons is because these groups are receiving millions of dollars from the federal government to house and transport illegal aliens across the country. And these are groups like Catholic Charities. These are, there's a group called Church World Service, but there are Lutheran groups. There are Presbyterian, like they're from any mainline Protestant denomination, or groups of them. Most of them have an affiliated group here, and they're not always affiliated with the actual church structures. So this doesn't necessarily condemn like all the churches across America. But I looked at the financials here, and Catholic Charities, for instance, gets more money from the federal government than it does in private donations. And that's Catholic Charities. That's the big kahuna. The smaller ones, like I think it was Church World Service, got something like 86% of all its operating revenue from federal government grants. So these groups would not exist without federal funding. And they are the immigration industrial complex, as I call them, moving illegals across the country. And we have research showing that every single congressional district, except one, got illegals from the places that are operated.
And as we move to wrap up, I think the question on everybody's mind, and again, I feel like what we've seen happening the last few weeks might support this. Is there a chance that the Woketopus is at least parts of it are going to be put to death, so to speak, or stopped with Trump back in the Oval Office?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and I think that is the top of mind on this. Um, so the Woketopus, some of the tentacles are pulling back from the administration. Some of the tentacles are retrenching, and some of the tentacles will be chopped off. But the way that I see it is most of the Woketopus, which is these non-governmental organizations, these NGOs, these nonprofits that are staffing and infiltrating and pushing the federal government, they are, um, they still exist. We have to remember Trump is in the office. That doesn't mean this influence campaign is over. So a lot of the woke activists are leaving the federal government, going to these organizations, preparing for a government in exile the next time an ideologically aligned, a woke person comes into the Oval Office. They're going to be ready. Also, those organizations are fighting to oppose the Trump administration. So you have lawsuits to stop his mass deportation. You have lawsuits to stop his efforts to bring sanity to the federal government. To the big layoff offer that he just extended, where he's saying, "Look, we want to cut the federal workforce. If you want to resign now, uh, we'll pay you through the end of September." It's a really big, good deal for these people. There are groups out there in the Woketopus that are suing to block that. And then the third aspect is that the deep state exists. A lot of these woke activists are going to stay in the federal government and try to oppose Trump from within. There was this really shocking poll that found that 64% of Washington, D.C. based federal bureaucrats who voted for Kamala Harris in the last election said they would not follow a lawful Trump order if they thought that it was bad policy. That one statistic is the deep state in a nutshell. And I think, Trump is doing a lot of really excellent things to fight that, but this is a long-term battle, and it's not something that can be solved with a few executive orders. He's doing I mean, I have tremendous confidence that Russ Vought at OMB is going to bring change, but one of the reasons I wrote the book was to highlight this influence campaign and show that this is a lasting threat. So Trump is doing a great job right now, but he faces a lot of headwinds, and the book is still a good roadmap for them to respond to a lot of this pushback he's going to.
And in terms of, reader takeaway, somebody spends the time, they read through, get to that last page of the book. Like, how do you want them to be empowered? Like, what can the average citizen, like, they have information now. How can they make a difference? How can they help be part of a solution?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, I mean, my number one thing is when you vote, don't just think about the person at the top of the ticket. Think about the people that they're going to bring into an administration. Federal government is a behemoth. And in order to bring sanity to that behemoth, you have to have a president who is willing to actually exercise control over it. And, what we saw under Biden should be a wake up call. I want it to be a wake up call for the Democrats too. I think it is egregious that there's only one party that wants to take on this administrative state, that wants to cut waste and abuse in the federal government. Like, this is something Democrats should be able to agree on. I think it's just like on the trans issue. I don't want Republicans always to win. I want to see a world where we have sanity in our politics such that a committed Christian who follows, the dictates of the Bible can seriously consider voting for either party. I don't want this to be partisan. And I don't think this book is partisan. And I encourage people to say, like, look, um, you may agree with some of the things that the Woketopus is pushing, but this influence campaign is something that we have to oppose as Americans first. Um, and so that's part of one of the other. There are a few different actions Americans can take. Naturally, I say buy the book, talk about it with other people. But I also say, the federal bureaucracy, whenever they issue new rules, they have to open things up for a period of notice and comment. And bureaucrats have to read through every comment that people leave on a law, so on a regulation. So one of the important things Americans can do is engage in the notice and comment process. leave a comment. There are many organizations out there. Heritage Action for America is one of them that highlights these rules that are in process and makes it easy for you to leave a comment on them, to weigh in one way or the other. This is a really easy and helpful way that the American people can make their voices heard in the bureaucracy in Washington. But there's also, we need to stay vigilant, and we have to remember, this is a long-term battle. Getting our country back to sanity is not going to be easy, nor is it going to be quick. I think a lot of people thought Trump won in 2024. That's over. We can move on with our lives. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but we can't. These woke forces are going to continue to try to push their ideology on you. And just because Trump won one election one time, he's won 2 elections. But just because he won this election doesn't mean the battle is over. And I think it's important to engage. It's important to make your voices heard. It's important to say, Americans want reform in our federal government. And just having, we're seeing the pushback right now on this buyout offer, on some things like Schedule F that Trump wants to bring back. That was at the end of his first term, never fully got implemented. But these are things that would make the federal bureaucracy more accountable to the president, who is elected by the people. And there are structural changes that need to be implemented. And on the left, you hear constantly they're saying, oh, this is getting rid of the public service. This is undermining and they always say undermining our democracy. What they really mean is undermining their bureaucracy. And we have to constantly remember what happened in COVID. We have to remember what happened in the Biden administration. It is not enough that Trump got elected. We have to keep constantly thinking about what's going to happen next and how do we combat the narrative. And this book shines a light on the long-term threats that the American people face. And I think it's very important and will remain important.
And Tyler, in terms of the listeners and viewers connecting with you, finding more of your writing, finding your books, where are some of the places we can connect with you on the web?
Yeah, so it's funny to say this because Amazon used to rely on the Southern Poverty Law Center. So I'm not like the biggest fan of Amazon, but Amazon is where most of the books are sold. So the Woketopus is available on Amazon. It's available in 3 different formats: ebook, paperback, and hardcover. It's going to be an audiobook in April. Making Hate Pay is also on Amazon. You can also find them sold on other platforms. Pretty much wherever you find good books, you can buy these. You can follow me on X on Tyler2, the number 2 O'Neill, O'Neil, just 1 L. I'm not the Cardinals player. There's a Tyler O'Neill with 2 L's who used to play for the Cardinals. Now he's bought by the Orioles. But you can find me there. You can find me on Truth Social. You can follow the Daily Signal. We're doing excellent work. One of our reporters, Elizabeth Mitchell, has published stories about the California wildfires that have got Gavin Newsom shaking in his boots. So follow the Daily Signal, dailysignal.com. We're on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Truth Social, Rumble. We're all over the place. And of course, we have podcasts. My excellent colleagues, Virginia Allen and Rob Bluey, and also Elizabeth Mitchell, bringing you the best news of the day in 10 minutes at 5 p.m. every weekday, and then a big interview. And then, of course, we have Bradley Devlin interviewing important people on the Hill in his Signal Sit Down. So a lot of exciting things happening at the Daily Signal. Those are where you can follow us.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to websites mentioned, social media accounts, as well as places where you can pick up your very own copy of Tyler's brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Tyler O'Neill. Once again, our book today was The Woketopus, The Dark Money Cabal Manipulating the Federal Government. And Tyler, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks again so much for having me.